Good morning, and welcome to our presentation on Harriette Whiteman and Dr. Elva McAllaster. I'm curious, before we get started here, how many of you in the audience were either a colleague or a student of one or both of these women? This is great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you for coming. It's been my privilege. My name is Brian Hartley, and I've chaired the project, and I was so excited to be able to be a part of this particular presentation because Dr. Mack was my advisor from the day that Dave Altop, who was just here, passed me off from his freshman group. And Harriette became actually my primary teacher. I think I took more classes with her than anybody else here on campus. Joining me in the research is my longtime friend, Mikey Ward. Mikey here. Mikey is a young alum from the class of 2013, and he has honed his research skills and dug out a lot of information, particularly about Dr. Mack. I should tell you, if you weren't here earlier, we had clear criteria established by our advisory board in terms of who we were going to do research on. And Dr. Mack's collection turned out to be the second largest collection in the archive of any woman who had been affiliated with Greenville University, second only to Dr. Mary Alice Tenney, who she described as her guardian angel. So we'll get into that here in just a moment. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about Harriette Whiteman. And Harriette was unlike any other teacher I had had. She had a flair for the dramatic. And oftentimes she would come whizzing into class maybe a few moments late with books under either arm, looking a bit frazzled. And she would throw the books down and would immediately launch into some dramatic reading. It might be a Middle English class, and we would hear something like, one, and off we would go to Middle English, right? Juan the Doppel with the Shurasuta, the draught of earth is pierced into the root, and bathed every vein and switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fluor. That's the way the class would start. But the one I remember, and I was just asking my friend Joe Tarantino, who I think was in this class with me, and prepare to be embarrassed, some of you. She oftentimes would press the envelope. This was a children's literature course, and we were reading a book that had been recently published by the author Judy Blume. And many of you, if you know Judy Blume's name, will know that her books oftentimes appear on banned books lists. And so one of the books that had come out at that time was entitled, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. This book has recently been made into a movie. And it's a story of an adolescent girl about 12 years of age who is coming into womanhood. And Harriette asked us to turn to the appropriate page and asked the class to stand, and we were going to reenact a scene from said book. So we had the book in front of us, and there was Harriette in the front, as this girl wanted to encourage her maturity and was engaged in exercises. We must increase our bust. The bigger the better, the tighter the sweater, the boys will surely lust. And we looked around to make sure we were in the right class. But that narrative, which my wife always warns me, Brian, don't tell that story. I say, I can't not tell the story because it encapsulates Harriette. All right. So there is a picture of her. Well, who was this woman who would engage in such behavior? Well, the first thing you need to know is she was the daughter of a Free Methodist bishop. And her father had also been college president at one of our sister schools, Spring Arbor. She was the firstborn of his second marriage, so her father was actually in his 50s when she was born, and he died when she was about 14 years of age. So you can imagine the kind of impact that would have on a young woman. She married Lester Whiteman. Harriette Warner married Lester Whiteman, and those of you who knew Lester, I hope you would agree with me that he was a somewhat eccentric character. Got an amen on that one. She graduated from Greenville College in 1935, so both she and Dr. Mack were alums whom I believe from the little bit we've seen were groomed by Dr. Mary Alice Tenney. Dr. Tenney had an eye for spotting women and men, but women who could later go on to leadership. She taught a wide plethora of courses. She taught English, Latin, French, fine arts, and of course, a lot of the English curriculum. She began her professional career at her father's college, where he had been president at Spring Arbor. She taught there for 3 years, gravitated to Central Junior College in Kansas, where she taught for 6 years, had students like the wily W. Richard Stevens as a student, and then came to Greenville, where she taught from 1955 to 1985. Her list of accomplishments is large. She was elected to the Outstanding Educators of America. She was a member of 6 professional organizations. She served as department and division chair. I saw her when I was doing graduate work in Princeton because she was hired by the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey, to come and read essays. And she was an infamous European tour leader. Alongside her friend, Dr. Elva McAllaster, they sort of formed the heart of the English faculty. Anybody who was a student here between roughly the mid-1950s and the mid-1980s you had a great chance of having a class with one or both of them. She went by Aunt Harriette or H to her colleagues. My primary instructor, as I've said, my mentor, my guide to the wonders of early English literature. She challenged stereotypes, and as you've just heard, she was not afraid to be somewhat iconoclastic in the classroom. But she had a great love, a love that emanated from her of art, all things literary and artistic. So I asked this question: how did she learn to find a place in the academy and lead in a time when women had just received the opportunity to vote beginning in 1920, but women were oftentimes denied positions of leadership both in the church and the academy? So I discovered a number of interesting things. How many of you in the room today know what the WCTU is? All right, good, we're aging ourselves there, because when I ask my students today, they haven't the foggiest. She participated early on in her career in several programs from regional and national meetings of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Of course, the WCTU was a religious organization whose primary purpose was to combat the influence of alcohol on families and societies. It was influential, obviously, in the temperance movement and supported the 18th Amendment. Many scholars believe that it was perhaps the last of the great reforms that was inaugurated after the Second Great Awakening beginning with slavery, the restriction of the vote, and then rampant alcoholism. All were targeted, oftentimes by women's organizations, towards bringing freedom and liberation. WCTU was founded in Cleveland, Ohio, Joe, in November of 1874. Frances Willard is the name that's most oftentimes associated with the WCTU. She took over the leadership in 1879, and the WCTU then became one of the largest and most influential women's groups of the 19th century, expanding its platform beyond simply alcohol reform to campaign for labor laws, prison reform, and women's suffrage. They are what we would call today a progressive movement. With Willard's death in 1898, the WCTU began to distance itself from feminist groups, instead focusing primarily on prohibition. And so many early Free Methodists were a part of that movement, that temperance movement. In fact, Dr. Holtwick, whom some of you will remember, actually ran on the 1952 national ticket for the presidency of the United States. So Greenville and its connection to reform around the abuse of alcohol, those roots run very deep. The WCTU then provided a place for women to both learn and to lead. And so a body of women came together to work towards a common cause and a national mission in which they participated. What about Harriette's participation? Go back here. There we are. Harriette participated at the 1939 regional gathering in Cleveland, which was the 65th anniversary of the WCTU, where she performed a dramatic monologue in front of thousands entitled "The Uncrowned Queen." This production then received such rave reviews that she was asked to go to their national convention, which was held that year in Rochester, New York, which was providential because, as many of you know, we have another sister college, Roberts Wesleyan College, which is very close there, but at that time it was called Chesborough Seminary. And Chesborough Seminary in 1939 sent an a cappella choir to sing, which fronted Harriette's production of The Uncrowned Queen. I looked everywhere I could, and I couldn't find any notes in the archives in terms of what the Uncrowned Queen actually addressed. What I did find, and you'll see it in this slide, were some of her penned attempts to describe the outfit that she wore. And so that's in our archives. At that 1939 production by the WCTU, her production was followed by addresses by guest speakers on spiritual education, alcohol education, and character education. So her production fit right in. Harriette was listed in the program as an honored guest and called upon to bring her one-woman show to not only that stage, but to later stages as well. Throughout the years, Harriette would present academic papers at national meetings in her field, and you'll hear from Mikey here shortly. She was a part of the Conference on Christianity and Literature, which Dr. Tenney and Dr. Mack helped to establish, and which today continues to meet and draws hundreds and thousands of scholars. So she would present papers at national meetings, but she was also called upon on campus, as many faculty were, to address students in more informal ways. So I found buried in the archives her handwritten notes when she was asked to come and provide advice on dating to students. Now, unfortunately, this is not dated, so I can't tell you when she delivered this particular address. She was part of a panel of women who were speaking to women. It looks like it probably took place in Ladue Chapel. And in her notes, she had 4 main points, which I found quite fascinating. She advised the women that they should engage in more casual dating, not just formal dating. She encouraged them to participate in more double dating, to participate in more hobbies and campus activities, and then finally, the one that I think is the piece de resistance, less car riding with boys and less walking in the gullies. So oftentimes faculty were called upon to engage in these less formal opportunities. Finally, her last European tour, which Lester accompanied her on, was in January of 1979, and I was finishing up my classroom work, and Harriette was directing my honors thesis. And so Darlene and I were able to go on that last trip that she directed, and we have many, many anecdotes we could share with you. But one was we had some free days that we could use our Brit Rail pass and go to various places throughout the United Kingdom. And Harriette had a friend, Tess, who lived down in County Somerset, who had agreed to pick us up. She was just taking Darlene and myself, pick us up at the railroad station, and take us to Arthurian sites, because I was working on Arthurian literature scattered throughout Somerset. And so it was a winter's day, and we wound up at the remains of an abbey called Glastonbury, if any of you have been there. It was one of the largest abbeys, actually, in England before the dissolution by Henry VIII in the 16th century. And it is purportedly the burial grounds for King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. It was a muddy day, and by this point in her career, Harriette was getting a little bit unsteady on her feet, so she walked with a cane. She always had this cane that she would, we went in the Louvre and she would tap on Michelangelo's David. I don't think you could do that today. But she kept that cane with her, and she insisted on taking my wife up to the top of Glastonbury Tor. And so it was muddy, as I say, and it took a while to get up there. So by the time we all got up there, we were coated in mud. And this was when I saw Harriette come alive. There was a big smile that spread across her face. And here she stood with mud and this cane, and she turned to us with that dramatic flair, and she said, "Brian and Darlene, if you look out across the vista, you can almost see Camelot." That is one of my favorite memories of Harriette. She was one of a kind, and she left an indelible mark on our institution as a woman unafraid to lead out during a time when men were primarily the ones at the helm, but she did so with gusto, joy, and panache. And many of us were the unworthy recipients of that teaching. So I'm very grateful. Mikey's going to come now and take you on a journey through some of the brief archives we've been able to look at in Dr. Mack's collection.
Good morning, everyone. As Dr. Hartley said, I have the opportunity to present on and do research on Dr. Mack, or Dr. Elva McAllaster. So my title is A Far-Reaching Commission from the Lord, and those are her words and how she articulates her vocation as a teacher here for 34 years and at Seattle Pacific College for 6 years. but this is her lifelong discernment of her joyous vocation. And what I love about her 40 years of teaching is that she continued to discern her vocation, even in the midst of, she was here for 34 years. It wasn't a stagnant, it was ongoing, it was life-giving and joyful. So kind of the abstract of kind of my research, kind of distilling it down, what you'll see in the next 15 minutes. The materials so far, as Dr. Hartley said, and I have the desire to always turn back to the screen, so bear with me, but it reveals a woman whose free Methodist spirituality. She was born in rural Kansas, so juxtaposed to Aunt Harriette, who it appears was Spring Arbor and Cleveland area, a little more urban, more humble beginnings with the grass roof and farmland of Kansas, but a deep spirituality, Free Methodism, and how it informed her career in Free Methodist higher ed as her commission from the Lord himself. So as a professor of English at, like I said, Seattle Pacific, 1948 to 1956, and GC, 1956 to 1988, Ms. McAllaster articulated her teaching career as the ultimate opportunity to, quote, train leaders of Free Methodism in order to have a far-reaching consequence for the Free Methodist Church. So she saw herself as an English professor equipping Free Methodist leaders for the Free Methodist Church, for the mission of Free Methodism. Spanning 40 years, this would take root, but there was something that happened dramatically in her 2 years here at Greenville College from 1942 to 1944. And in particular, it was her mentorship with Dr. Mary Alice Tenney, or as her family would say, May Tenney. And then three documents I did a deep dive on. I could have spent months. I could still be down in the basement of the library right now with the amount of material that she accumulated throughout her career. But three kind of show that her experience at Greenville not only altered her vocation, but it helped give rise to a national scholarly organization, the Conference of Christianity and Literature, which still exists today. And it started in 1956, but it has a very Free Methodist and Greenville origin, and you'll see that in the later slides. And ultimately, what I see is research on Dr. Mack reveals how women leaders in Greenville's English department were influential not only in Free Methodism and Free Methodist higher ed, but more broadly the development of Christian literary scholarship throughout the 20th century in America. And that's not me being hyperbolic. That's me connecting the dots that have been there the whole time. And it's really encouraging for me to rediscover that history and to play a small part in telling their story. So there she is. There were a series of photos that I could have picked. I enjoy this one, but key themes that I found in her research, just more broadly, you'll see it in the three documents. Number one, Free Methodism is a place that prioritizes education. Per capita, the denomination, how many higher ed institutions we have, it speaks to that. And it speaks to her family in particular. Her mother was a school teacher for much of her life. That was going to be her vocation. She, in fact, went back to be a school teacher for 2 years. And then with a good old camp message, I didn't experience those camp messages as a young teen. I now have been out to Durley, and I've experienced them. But she had a life-altering experience. Maybe many of you have had a life-altering experience at hearing a homily or a message at camps. But her two brothers were also doctors, one a physician and one a PhD in biblical studies. So There was one sibling who did not go on and earn a doctorate, so I can just imagine kind of the inferiority complex that could have taken place there, right? Second theme is just Greenville's English department and women in leadership in particular. I've stated this already, you'll hear it throughout. But it all kind of traces back to this one woman, Dr. Mary Alice Tenney. And I believe she's the most important woman leader in the history of Greenville's campus. But I would say she's top 2 or 3 overall most important individuals who have walked these holy grounds in the last 150, 175 years. Dr. Mack highlights this as Dr. Tenney as one of the most significant Greenville leaders, and it's because of Dr. Tenney's ability to mentor and to have that relationship. And it speaks to my experience and many of y'all's experience here at Greenville of that mentorship, that one-to-one. I am a product of that model of mentorship with Dr. Hartley. Dr. Hartley was my mentor, is my mentor, now friend, and it's a continuation of that lineage. Greenville as the geographical and intellectual epicenter of Free Methodism. Okay, that's a theme, thirdly, especially in the middle of the 20th century. Now, some things may have changed in the last 50 to 60, 70 years, but they articulate this time and time again, that this is the epicenter, this is the holy grounds for Free Methodism. Specifically because of GC's ability to produce college professors. We have many in the room here today. And its relationship with the GFMC. And then lastly, that she'll highlight the emphasis on Greenville's excellent library in the middle of the 20th century, and that's because of the leadership of Ruby E. Dare. So continuing on, just student-centered education leading to innovation. She reflected this, the English department reflected this, and specifically her newsletters for Christian professors of English and the Conference of Christianity and Literature. It begins in the classroom with the question of how best to form the next generation of Free Methodist leaders. So a big part of the conversation in the 50s was, what do we do with censorship? Do we censor? Do we teach banned books? And her and Mary Alice and Aunt Harriette, it's very much of, if we don't teach it, then who is? And it's, we're not going to shy away from these topics. We're going to confront them. And I see the fruits of that decision continuing on in the classrooms here today and broadly within Free Methodism. In 1980, she later looks back at the CCL as a sturdy oak of a national organization that began as a little acorn that she lightly tossed into moist hummus. And I just love the way that she frames that. You can see, even in her leadership, her administrative work, her poetic lens and her ability to articulate big ideas through metaphor. And then two last points. Discerning vocation as an ongoing learning outcome as Christian higher ed. She wrote early in her career in her journals and through her photojournals of kind of this lifelong discernment of her, quote, commission from the Lord himself. And then lastly, just the classroom is a sacred space, and it's a mission field. That's the way that she saw it. She may not have been given ample opportunities to come up and to preach the word, but I can attest from her students that the classroom was her pulpit in many ways. And I believe that her classroom was where her vocation was continually transformed. And it lives on today. So I teach at a high school in St. Louis. I think very much the things that she emphasized in her career, I implicitly and explicitly embody in my classroom and pass on to my students. And there are thousands of classrooms across the nation still to this day. So the first of 3 noteworthy preliminary documents, just her personal journals. And I highlighted one. It was a 5-year journal. Now, I don't know if, did anyone, show of hands, have a 5-year journal? It was kind of the craze of the 30s and 40s and 50s, but it demonstrated a shift in vocation that led her to Greenville. Her mother and her Free Methodist education, it began at Central Academy in McPherson, where she graduated in 1938, and she expressed the goal of becoming a schoolhouse teacher just like her mother, and in fact she did. 2 years, she returned and was a schoolhouse teacher for 2 years, 1940 to 1942. Specifically in Greeley County, that's her home county. However, the journals attest to a Free Methodist camp meeting in April of 1940, and it sparked a growing desire for her to return to school in order to become a missionary teacher in China. So that was her mission. That was her why for coming to Greenville. She was already teaching, but she needs to come and get a bachelor's so that she could become a missionary and go and follow her vocation in China as a missionary teacher. However, here in the classrooms of Dr. Tenney, over the next 2 years, her vocation changed. And throughout her life, as Dr. Hartley said, she described Tenney as her patron saint and guardian angel. And you used the language of groomed. I would say opened up her vocational imagination that she could become a professor of literature and that she had the abilities and the skills to do so. So, Dr. Tenney specifically highlighted her love of literature, her ability to study, and her ability to teach her classmates. It was suited for her to become a professor. So she would go on from her time at Greenville, earn a master's at University of Illinois, and additionally her PhD from the University of Illinois in 1948. So the second preliminary document that I think highlights just this ongoing discernment of her vocation is, like I said, the article, 1980 article, First Sproutings, First Rootlets, the Beginning of the CCL. After completing her doctoral dissertation on the Oxford movement, she earned a position at Seattle Pacific, and for the next 6 years, she would be the chair of their department before they made a transition from a 2-year institution to a 4-year institution. In the fall of 1950, as the chair, I can only imagine her workload. I can only imagine her responsibilities. She's asking questions of, what do I do? I feel isolated. I feel separated. And she begins to develop what she calls a newsletter for Christian teachers of college English. And I very much believe it's from her mother's tutelage and her mother's ability to gain all the letters from the family. A reminder that her brother is doing studies away from Kansas. Both of her brothers are at that point. So her mother would pool all of the letters, and then she would write up a newsletter and disperse it out to everyone of what are the greatest hits of what your brothers and sisters are saying. And it was very much this methodology that gave rise to this newsletter. So she said, here are my questions. I'm going to send it out to people that I know nationally. Return your notes, your letters. I will compile it all, and I will disperse it again. So it was very much of, how do I become a better teacher? And very quickly, she was not only working alongside a multitude of different teachers nationally, but she kind of became this center point. I'm lacking for a phrase or a word, but she became deeply more significant of these questions of how do we teach, what do we teach, what should Christian teachers of college English be doing, be thinking about, what materials should we be reading. And so she became deeply significant just through her asking and compiling people's responses. So her networking, there's the word, across Christian higher ed, the newsletter soon became a successful network. And it became a network of people who shared new courses, new jobs, traveling, writing, speaking engagements, it really became something bigger than what she had an imagination for. This little acorn of asking for help became the ground, the roots of a strong organization. So with McAllaster at the lead, the newsletter soon functioned with the goal to encourage each other to newer, deeper levels of Christian faith and practice, as well as to professional excellence. In the spring of 1951, in fact, they had their first they proposed a special section for English professors at the 1951 General Conference for the Free Methodist Church in Hillsdale, Michigan. So she, in her letters, was actually very excited about this because she reported back to her family, I'm going to be able to be a representative at General Conference, and they're going to pay for me to go. Isn't that great? So that was one motivation for the beginning of this conference. But it's really, really fascinating to see that this National Scholarly Conference had its origins in General Conference. So the meeting is described by McAllaster as a small scale, but something new under the sun, something heartening and inspirational. And then 1956, this is where it officially begins, and the CCL's original leadership include Dr. Tenney as vice president, and McAllaster as the secretary and the newsletter editor. And I've included one of the newsletters that I couldn't find all of the records of the newsletters, but I did find a copy in her correspondence with her family. And here are the stated purposes for the CCL. 1, Christian fellowship. 2, discussion of problems of the classroom, both as to writing and literature. 3, promotion of higher standards of Christian scholarship, including production as well as study. 4, contribution to current thought on the Christian approach to college teaching. 5, encouraging our students towards the highest goals. I'd love to hear a discussion on what those highest goals are. Number 6, efforts to pool our institutional needs and the placement of English teachers. 7, study of the possibilities and potentials of some sort of scholarly Christian periodical. And 8, a continuation of the newsletter to keep us united in our fellowship and purposes. So I think this speaks to her ingenuity, her ability to network, and her desire for her to be an excellent educator and inspire her peers to do so likewise. And I highlighted just the leadership here of Clyde Kilby from Wheaton College, Dr. May Tenney, and then she describes herself as yours truly as the treasurer and newsletter editor. And then lastly, the third noteworthy preliminary document for her ongoing discernment of her vocation and the classroom being the starting point is her, this document. You'll notice it's confidential, so I think we can reclaim it from her archives and tell you about it now, but it's titled, Some Ingredients of the Inner Imperative for Me to Return to Greenville. And so this is her work of just, I think it's a note to herself, her discerning of, should I leave Seattle Pacific? Should I go back to Greenville College? It's a wrestling with this, and so in classic Dr. McAllaster style, she got out her typewriter and wrote it out. This memo outlines 8 points. You'll notice, if you look very thoroughly, there's not 8, but there's 9 points. There's the letter 8 2 times. So I won't break out my red pen for her, but she highlights the geographical location of Greenville as the epicenter of Free Methodism. So when I said that earlier, it's not my words, it's her words. She emphasizes Greenville's ability to connect and stay connected to alumni. She highlighted Dr. Ruby Dare's excellent library as a reason to return. She highlighted the institution's relationship with the Free Methodist Church and the Greenville Free Methodist Church in particular. She highlighted Free Methodism's representation among the student population. And last but not least was Greenville's very fine record in producing college teachers. Over the next 34 years, McAllaster would live out her vocation here at Greenville. So my conclusion, just kind of doing a deep dive on these 3 documents, is that McAllaster and research on her reveals how the reach of her vocation as a professor of English at Greenville, as a literary scholar, as a leader in the CCL, continues today in two organizations, here at Greenville and the CCL. In 1980, like I said earlier, she described the CCL as a sturdy oak of the national organization. It still is continuing today, that she lightly tossed into moist hummus. And then ultimately, through both her teaching career and her leadership, it is evident that McAllaster's lifelong discernment of vocation as student, she was a lifelong student, as teacher and writer, ultimately reflected her hope that God would multiply her influence manyfold and have far-reaching consequences. So this is my attempt to zoom out, the extent of which lives on within Greenville University, most pointedly the honors program that honors her name, the mission of the CCL, her scholarship and writings, and then in the thousands of lives indelibly changed by her and her students. And I am honored to say that I'm one of those individuals. I believe that many of you are some of those individuals as well. So I thank you for your time, and this is my little spiel on Dr. Elva McAllaster. Thank you.
We need to stick to the time restrictions as much as possible, but we might have time for a question or two. There are others in the room who I'm sure knew both of these individuals better than Mikey and I, but we'd be glad to try to entertain any questions about archival materials, which are much greater than our ability to even scratch. Anybody have a question? Dr. Mack always taught us to not be afraid of silence. Yes, Dave.
Harriette had two children.
Yes, she did.
Gloria, and I can't remember the son's name.
Yeah, David.
David, right. And
Yeah.
I think he became an architect too, like his dad, didn't he?
Yes, so I saw David here in town not too long ago. He was here for Ann Zonizer's memorial service and had a chance to speak with him and was able to send him some of our preliminary materials on Harriette, and he was very, very grateful for that. Yes, two children.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for attending. We need to reset here. We want to give plenty of time for the group that's presenting on Miss Dare. Some of you may remember Miss Dare. Just a tremendous story of a woman who came to do one thing and wound up doing something else, and because of what she did as that something else, it really changed our campus, not to mention keeping us from getting in trouble with the North Central Association, who were not impressed in 1947 with the closet in Hogue Hall where our library was contained. Thank you all.